we at IIHS are really grateful, Professor Sanjeev Gupta ji, for your unremitting encouragement, support, and cooperation. I take this opportunity to remember and thank Professor Ashwini Kush, Director IT Cell, for being always so supportive in assisting us with the technical support that we always need at IIHS or at the front of Literary Club. Now, taking this workshop ahead, I would now like to invite Dr. Sayan to begin with his first technical session on research perspectives in Indian science fiction. Over to you, Dr. Sayan.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jimmy. Thank you so much, Professor Raina, Professor Gupta, for this really warm introduction. And I think a very well background of this workshop has already been fleshed out by including Dr. Siddhartha as well, and so which also actually just sets the pace for me to go ahead with the presentation. So just hold on. What I'm trying to do is trying to open up my slides. I have a very few slides just where I have put down my points. And at a later stage, I would like to share the slides with Jimmy. Jimmy can circulate it amongst every one of us, because in one of the slides, that is in slide 4, as we go ahead, there are some articles which I have hyperlinked on the slides. And if you just click on those links, you can just open up and check out those methodological articles, which obviously is going to, I believe, is going to give you a better background of understanding of my presentation. But yes, so is, I don't know, is my slide visible to all of you? If you can just confirm.
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much once again. So what I'm going to, as I shared at the very brief introduction of this workshop, that I'm specifically going to focus on the aspect of methodology. And for science fiction in general and the Indian science fiction in particular. And my presentation would be for around 40 to 45 minutes. And then obviously we can open up for questions, reflections, and discussions. So what is my lecture plan for the next 40 to 45 minutes? With respect to the methodological question, I'll make every effort to address these 3 questions. The first is why, then is how and what. So the first question I would like to address is obviously why it is important. I think that it is important to reread Indian science fiction works through a transdisciplinary methodological lens. And obviously, before I speak of how to do it, obviously it's a fundamental question that's going to cross across our mind, that why it is important to engage at all. What is the problem if we just imprison the narratives of Indian science fiction within the paradigm of English literature? And why it is a problem, why it is a challenge. These are some of the aspects I'm going to discuss in the first part of my lecture. In the second part of my reflection, I'm going to talk about the question about how we can reread Indian science fiction works through a transdisciplinary methodological lens. And it's not just about the Indian science fiction works, but also the science fiction works in general as well. It can be audiovisual works, it can be written works, it can be novel, etc. And what impact we may expect that the process of rereading may generate in the process. So briefly, these are the 3 questions that I look forward to discuss today in the process of my set of reflections. So coming to the first question, why it is important to reread. Now, again, as I think we have been talking about this aspect since morning, and it's again a very important aspect to engage with, that whether science fiction in general or the Indian science fiction in particular, should it be just read within the discipline of English literature, or it also should be understood in intersection with various paradigms of knowledges. Now the question is, you see, when we read a particular science fiction work or when we watch a particular science fiction movie, we see that the way the characters are established, the way the plots are constructed, the way the narratives are organized, by default, in a very spontaneous manner, those characters, narratives, plots, they intersect with each other. They intersect with various forms of disciplines that exist around us. It could be gender studies, it could be sexual studies, it could be race studies. In the Indian context, it could be caste studies, it could be technological studies, it could be artificial intelligence studies, and various other forms of ideas can be taken into account when we are reading a particular science fiction work. But the question is, if we look the way a science fiction is kind of perceived within an academic institution, especially if we are talking about the curricular space, what we see is, on a majority of the occasions, until and unless it is at the PhD level where you see that, okay, people are indulging in various cross-disciplinary works in science fiction, but if you are taking at the honors or the master's level, a majority of the times we read science fiction within English literature. Now, as an individual, as a student, as a researcher, as a tutor, I have always, and I still grapple with this question, that why we need to read a science fiction work exclusively within the discipline of English literature, and why we can't engage with this space in other disciplinary aspects as well. Now, is it just because the term fiction is associated with science, so it by default has to be a sort of English literary thing? Well, for me, at least as an individual, I feel for me that is very problematic. And that is, in fact, I would go to the extent of arguing that it is a sort of generating a disciplinary stereotype on the one side, and on the other side, it is also a way of not allowing other discourses to join in this space of English literature. Now, so obviously, if you have to overcome this challenge, if you have to overcome this problem, what we need to do is, it is important to generate transdisciplinary interpretative possibilities. Now, obviously, what do I mean by transdisciplinary interpretative possibilities? The first and the foremost thing is, when we are reading, now you see, any sort of knowledges that are produced around us, let's forget Indian science fiction for some time. Let us look into the general ways in which knowledges are produced around us, whether it's a oral sort of narrative, written narratives, in terms of songs, music, acting, performances, and in whatever ways we produce knowledge around us, it is by default, spontaneously, it is always transdisciplinary in nature. Now, whether we accept, whether we don't accept, that's our individual perspective, but we can't deny the fact that every sort of knowledge that is produced around us cannot be imprisoned within a set or within a particular discipline, because it is always in interaction with various other disciplines, various other paradigms of knowledges. So when I propose that let us indulge in transdisciplinary interpretative possibilities specifically for Indian science fiction, I am not proposing something new. I am not discovering something new. It is already there, right there into our existing space. What I am trying to do is trying to invite all of us to rethink the way we produce knowledges imprisoned within specific disciplines, number one. Number two, then by imprisoning knowledges within specific disciplines, we try to generate a sort of hierarchies around us, which is again very problematic to say, okay, science fiction best fits in English literature, science fiction best fits in gender studies, etc., which is again very problematic, because the moment we generate these sort of hierarchies, we are indulging into a problematic performance of negating certain ideas and including a selective set of certain ideas that appeals to us in some way or the other. So to break away, to shatter these problematic hierarchies, what is important for us is to indulge in a transdisciplinary interpretative possibility of interpreting science fiction in general, and obviously, as we are speaking in the context of Indian science fiction, so I will bring in the question of Indian science fiction in particular. Now, number 3 point, why I feel it is important to reread is, you see, whenever we are interpreting science fictional narratives, now usually what happens, like a very basic layperson's definition of Indian science fiction is where you indulge in the existing logical narratives of science, technology, engineering, and various other dynamics that intersects with imaginative possibilities. That is a very simple layperson's definition, where we have something which is realistic, which is logically proven out there, and something which may not be logically proven, but is something which emerges out of our own imagination. And when those two are blended, it gives birth to science fiction. Now, when you read any work, and I'm pretty sure you must have read or you must be going through while hearing my lecture, the works that have been shared by Dr. Siddhartha, though I'm not aware what short stories have been shared. But if you read through those works, I'm very much sure you will find a lot of disciplinary dimensions that are part of those works. They could be technological, they could be artificial intelligence, they could be cultural, they could be based on gender, they could be based on geographical dimensions, and probably various other aspects. Now, what happens? When we are thinking around science fiction is a very interesting creative space. Science fiction, if you read a lot of, not every work, I'm not trying to generalize and say every sort of work for science fiction, but there is a lot of science fiction works. If you read them, you will see that it is very difficult to fit that particular work in a very specific disciplinary space. You will see that it is kind of very fluid and porous in nature, and it interacts with various dimensions of thoughts, various experiences of our existence around us. So science fiction interpretation is not just about writing literary works or writing about essays, but science fiction works can also enable us to present our ideas, to present our interpretations through using various sorts of creative methods. It could be videos, it could be music, it could be painting, it could be digital art, hand paintings, crafts, and various ways. Because science fiction itself is a very interesting and creative space, and that is through a lot of creativities, science fiction space emerges. So to reread, the invitation to reread is also an invitation to think that what are some of those creative methods, apart from writing essays and chapters and papers and books, what are some of those creative methods that we can individually and collectively use to interpret science fiction works, or specifically Indian science fiction works. And obviously, the very important and obvious last point that why we should reread is to open up various unique and new possibilities of interpretations, probably which we may not have engaged so far, which we may not have thought so far, to reread the fiction, to reread, for instance, example, I think which also was raised kind of by Professor Raina, that where we, on the one side, often now a new tradition has come up in the Indian science fiction writing, Indian science fiction thinking, is to bring in, associate the established myths in Indian cultural space in general to associate with science fiction, which is again interesting. Now, already there is a lot of debate around this whole question whether myths are true or false, if they are logical, if they are imaginative in nature, and a lot of debates have taken place in favor and against all of these questions. And then associating it with science fiction actually re-invites us and kind of enables us to rethink this whole paradigm of myth, within this area of artificial intelligence, within this area of technology, within the space of engineering, within the space of cultural studies, within the space of gender studies. Obviously, they bring up various fictional elements. Those are mostly very imaginative in nature. But at the same time, we can't deny the fact that repositioning, recontextualizing mythical characters, recontextualizing mythical narratives within various fictional and realistic spaces in the contemporary era is also a way of giving a spark to our multiple ways of imagining the reality in our around us. Now, what I'm going to do is I will move into the second part of my reflections, and yes, so I have changed my slide. So please, can you confirm if my slide change is visible to all of you?
Yes.
Okay. So the second part of my reflection is, obviously now I have briefly discussed the question why. You can see there is a voice in the background. Can it be stopped, please?
Yes, I have muted him.
Okay. Okay, so now we come to the question, the second question, that is how to reread. So first, I have discussed why we need to reread this or revisit the whole way of interpreting science fiction narratives, Indian science fiction narratives. And the second part is how to reread. Now, as I shared all the 4 points, each of these points, they have an article. You can see already the link when I'm putting my cursor out there. So once obviously I'm done with my presentation, I'll be very happy to send you these these particular slide, and you can access these articles by clicking on just on these points. But prior to that, as I say that I'm exclusively going to focus on the question of methodology, what could be some of the possible ways of reading, some of the possible methods of rereading the Indian science fiction paradigm. And also let me clarify at the outset that this is not just the 4 ones which are available, but there are many other methods that can be used to reread Indian science fiction works in a very cross-disciplinary perspective, but I have specifically selected these 4 spaces. Now, the first question is positionality. And I believe this particular method of reading and interpreting applies to any kind of work that we indulge with, as it goes with Indian science fiction. Now, when we walk into a classroom, I'm pretty sure even today in the audience as well, there are a lot of people who have joined from different parts of India. It's not that they're just based or they're originally based in Kurukshetra, but there would be people across different parts of north, south, east, west India. And belongingness to different parts, different geographical space is not just a physical belongingness. We all know that. It is about various forms of cultural belongingness, linguistic belongingness, and various other aspects, so social belongingness, religious belongingness. So when we come from different parts, different geographical spaces, we also bring in a varieties of contexts, varieties of cultures, varieties of traditions, religions, beliefs, practices, lifestyles. Now, my question has always been, and again, it emerges from very personal set of experiences.
Excuse me, Dr. Sayan, the next slide is not visible. It is the same first slide. There is this lecture plan, why, how, and what that we are.
Okay, yes. I mean, that's why I was just wondering what. Let me do one thing. Let me just reshare my reshare my slides. All right. Now, is it visible? How to reread? Can you all see my slide? How to reread?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So now, as I was talking about the first point, the question of positionality. Now, why it is important to take into account wherever we are reading a work, whenever we are interpreting a work, including Indian science fiction, why it is important to take into account our positionality, to acknowledge the diversity of interpretations around us. Now, whenever we bring art, now maybe we are reading just one particular text. Maybe let us take the examples of the text that have been shared by our co-speaker, Dr. Siddhartha. Now, probably you are all reading the same set of text that has been written by an Assamese author. It is the same set of text, you are going through the same set of characters, you are going through the same set of stories. But you personally all are positioned in different cultural, political, social, gender, caste, class, religious, and various other contexts. Now, for some of you, it can be very directly relatable. Some of you, the text could be distantly relatable. And for some of you, maybe it could be entirely fictional in nature. Now, it is important for all of us, whenever we are sitting together and interpreting a particular text, let us not force each other to interpret in a very so-called, the mainstream manner. Let us not interpret the text in a so-called by indulging ourselves in a popular set of interpretations which are widely known across the world. That is a very problematic way of interpreting a text. Rather, what is important is to acknowledge our respective positionalities. Maybe our interpretations will all differ from each other. Maybe our interpretations are going to be in conflict with each other. Probably we would not accept each other's interpretation in any ways, but that doesn't mean that our interpretations are wrong. It is about more and more we have conflictual interpretations, more and more we have a multiplicity, a diverse forms of interpretations, more and more we are going to have new sets of ideas, new sets of thoughts around the aspect of Indian science fiction to come to the forefront. So it is very important to indulge through the method of positionality, that wherever we are positioned, whether as individuals, whether as communities, it is important to acknowledge that positionality and try to interpret the text, from those sets of positions. And I think again it very much connects to Professor Raina's reflection that how in fact he did an interpretation of Jane Austen in a very, very local context, which is again very interesting and a very powerful example of positionality, rather than following the usual trend of Eurocentric ways of interpreting, bringing in a very local context and trying to position Jane Austen in a very local context. And that could be applicable for every other text, including any sort of Indian science fiction text as well. The next thing is, if we can acknowledge these diverse sets of positionalities, what we are indulging ourselves is we are trying to generate a very powerful intersectional space around us. And that is what leads us to this whole method of intersectionality. That is where what it means, we create a space where maybe, for instance, I wish to interpret a text from the lens of gender studies. My colleague wishes to interpret a text from the lens of queer studies. My another colleague wishes to interpret the same text from race studies. Another trying to do it from caste studies. Another trying to do it from the lens of urban studies. And then we all share our thoughts with each other, and each of our thoughts, because it is based on the same text or the same set of text, there is always a possibility that maybe our lens of interpretations from our respective positionalities are different, but they all intersect with each other. They all speak to each other. They all interweave with each other. And that is a very interesting aspect of interpreting any sort of text, including an Indian science fiction text. Because for me, if you're reading, and I go back to the same example of myths, because as I shared, a lot of Indian science fiction works are being generated around the whole paradigm of myths in general. You see, we read the same sort of myths, we know a lot of mythical narratives, but you will see, for instance, if I take some very usual well-known examples. For example, if I talk about the usually established myths and legends, of Ramayana and Mahabharata, you will always see that these texts over generations, over centuries, have been interpreted in so many multiple ways. There could be, it has been interpreted from diverse caste dimensions, from diverse religious dimensions, from diverse cultural dimensions, from diverse gender dimensions. So there is always, now the myth remains the same, but the narratives, the stories, the positionalities of the characters, the social dynamics, the power structures undergoes multiple levels of transformation in multiple levels of interpretation. And that is the whole joy and the fun of intersectionality, that we all have our own ways of interpretation, which could be acceptable to some, which could not be acceptable to some, but it doesn't mean that we are going to indulge ourselves into this whole game of rejection. Let us put all those interpretations on the same plate and try to see how they are talking to each other. And that is this whole fun of intersectional methodology. Now, the moment we acknowledge these whole narratives of positionality and intersectionality, what we also lead us to is this whole point of critical discourse analysis. Now, critical discourse analysis is actually a very interesting. Now, what is a discourse? Like, for instance, like any sort of communication, any sort of interaction, any sort of exchanges that leads to the production of knowledges around us. But you will see one thing, and we can all observe from our respective life experiences, that it is not always necessary that what we speak is what we literally mean. I repeat that, it is always not necessary that what is being spoken is what is literally meant. Lot of words, lot of phrases, lot of ideas and thoughts, they are always subjected to multiple layers of thinking. They're always subjected to multiple layers which exist beyond the physical appearance of the words and the phrases. And whatever we speak in our daily life, in fact, today also sitting here, whatever I am speaking to all of you, emerges from a set of my personal experiences, from a sort of set of biasnesses, set of political experiences, set of existential and various other forms of existential experiences. So I am not just speaking just for the sake of speaking. I'm trying to mean something. I'm trying to generate a sort of unique paradigm of thinking around this aspect of Indian science fiction. I'm inviting all of us to rethink the ways we interpret Indian science fiction. But all of these invitations, all of these reflections emerges from a set of positionalities, emerges from a set of intersectional experiences. And that is why my words are not just mere words. My ideas are not just mere ideas. It is a whole set of reflection, a lot of politics, society, culture, gender, geographies, and various other experiences. And that is why this method of interpreting somebody's speech, somebody's words, somebody's reflections with respect to diverse contexts is what is referred to as critical discourse analysis. That is why the word critical is used here. It could have been just been said as discourse analysis. It is not just as discourse analysis. It is critical discourse analysis because it is this word critical that invites us to go beyond the physical layers of certain ideas and phrases and try to unearth the different sorts of power dynamics, social dynamics, and the different sorts of structures that are hidden beyond those physical layers. Again, this critical discourse analysis is a very important aspect of interpretation for the sake of Indian science fiction. Because as we have been talking about, that whenever we indulge with various characters, various plots, various geographical contexts, various events, some are realistic, some are fictional, they are blending with each other, interacting with each other. We all should try to understand by sitting into a respective context. Even if it is a story is based in Assam, even if it is a story is based in Bengal, even if there is a story which is based, let's say, in Rajasthan, let us try to understand if we are from, for instance, let's say we are from Goa. Let us try to understand within the cultural space of Goa, how it could be interpreted. How the one person coming from the cultural context of Goa try to understand the story that is based in the cultural context of Assam. And that would be possible if we use this whole paradigm of critical discourse analysis, where we try to take into account different cultures, traditions, lifestyles, thought processes, and try to understand how the story narrative fits into which of these spaces. And another very important method that I would like to share with all of you is the critical diversity literacy. Now, what is critical? Again, the word critical comes here. Let's take into account. It's not just about diversity. It's not just about literacy, but it is about critical diversity literacy. Three very crucial ideas, three very crucial points. Now, what is critical diversity literacy? It is basically everything that we have been talking about. That is where we don't indulge ourselves of imprisoning the space of Indian science fiction within a particular discipline of English literature, but try to open up the multiple gateways of interaction with various other disciplines. It is also about not indulging ourselves into the performance of cancel culture. That is where we see, okay, I don't agree with you, so it means your interpretation is wrong. I find your interpretation offensive, so it means interpretation is wrong. No, that is very problematic. It could be wrong. I'm not saying every interpretation is right. It could be wrong. But understanding something is wrong just because I don't agree with that person is very problematic. And critical diversity literacy invites us to think that no, my interpretation could be in conflict with somebody else's interpretation, but let us try to understand those and acknowledge those, even if we don't agree. And most importantly, critical diversity literacy is a way of that involves ourselves to understand and value each other's cultures, traditions, lifestyles, ways of thinking, and ways of interpretation. That is why it is critical. Again, instead of just being loose and, sort of void enough to reject ideas without any sort of logic, we try to be critical and we try to think deeply and together. That is why it is called critical diversity literacy. That is the paradigm, the method through which we indulge in these sort of diverse ways of thinking in a critical manner, in a very highly inclusive manner, without rejecting each other's ideas and by acknowledging differences. That is how critical diversity literacy paradigm emerges. And it is again a very important part of, I believe, again a very important part of Indian science fiction, because as I said, in Indian science fiction, we bring in a lot of narratives about technology, about myths, about cultures, about traditions and genders, and they intersect with a lot of fictional ideas and thoughts. And to acknowledge this diversity of thinking, to acknowledge this diversity of imagination, at the same time to acknowledge this diversity of existence around us, critical diversity literacy, along with the other three methods of critical discourse analysis, intersectionality, and positionality are very important. Now, what I'll do is, I will go into the next slide, and which is going to be my last part of my presentation, and then obviously we can go ahead with reflections and questions. But before I go ahead, I wish to confirm once again that is the last slide available, what impact it may create. Is it visible to all of you?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay, excellent. Now, coming to the last part of my presentation. So now we have talked about why, we have briefly talked about how, and as I said, that is not the end of the story. There are various other methods we can use. I just chose 4 selective spaces that possibly and probably I'm currently indulged in. And the last part is what impact it may create. Now, what we can expect. because it's a question of rereading. So what we can expect, what ways we can reread the whole paradigm of Indian science fiction. So the first one, it's clear, multidisciplinary exchanges, it opens up spaces, and now you see it has to be done in a very structured way. Now, it is an invitation for all of us. It is not just that this whole presentation is not just for the students, but it is also for us, the teachers and the researchers who daily engage with exchanges on Indian science fiction with students, that where we also try to think around how do we transform the pedagogy of teaching Indian science fiction in a very multidisciplinary manner, where through indulging guest lectures, bringing in experts in science fiction in general or Indian science fiction in particular, who indulges, maybe talks about or works on Indian science fiction, for instance, let's say from the paradigm of science and technology studies, STS, or from the paradigm of gender and sexuality studies, or from the paradigm of queer studies, or from the paradigm of caste studies, class studies, race studies, and bringing those people with an interaction with teachers and students to tell that, you see, it's not just about literature. As a science student, as a science expert, I can also interpret Indian science fiction in this way. As an engineering expert, I can interpret Indian science fiction in this way. As a cultural expert, I can interpret Indian science fiction in this way. So these sorts of multidisciplinary exchanges needs to be developed. Now it appears, I'm pretty sure for many of us who are listening to me, it appears like a kind of very a utopian plan sort of idea, that it sounds great, but how do we apply? So obviously it is a slow process. It is going to take a lot of time to any sort of transformation takes a lot of time, but it needs to happen in a simultaneous and collective manner. Whereas individuals, whereas institutions, we need to come together and redesign this whole paradigm of Indian science fiction by opening up multiple sorts of exchanges with various disciplinary spaces, where we design our curriculums in such a manner that invites students to engage with Indian science fiction, that invites researchers to engage with Indian science fiction, not only who are officially associated with the literary space, but also from various other disciplines. We have been talking about across universities, across the UGC level and the higher education ministry level, to open up transdisciplinary, to establish transdisciplinary curriculums, pedagogies, to open up more and more interactions between different disciplines and to break away the existing hierarchies. So Indian science fiction redesigning, reconceptualizing the paradigm of interpreting Indian science fiction in this way could be a possible way to start for me. And if you're indulging in multidisciplinary exchanges, what we can do is we kind of engage ourselves into a powerful, inclusive performance of various caste, class, communities, genders, and various social spaces. So as I am bringing the Indian science fiction into the understanding, so I include the question of caste and class as well. We can bring in other factors as well. So the moment we involve and open up multidisciplinary exchange spaces, we also invite various communities. It is not just about inviting disciplines, but the various individuals from various communities and classes and genders who are part of those disciplines are also getting a scope to indulge this with Indian science fiction across different communities. So Indian science fiction is not just again about fiction, it is also a way of generating a space for community bonding, for class bonding, for cultural bonding and exchanges as well. And the third part, the third practical impact that it may generate is obviously through transforming, which I have obviously spoken about at the beginning throughout the lecture, and we have been speaking about this, we have been touching on this point from different contexts so far, and it is about the transforming the interpretative scapes of understanding and interpreting science fiction. That is the ways, the methods, the structures, the theories that we use to interpret science fiction, and that is what I refer to as interpretative scapes. Now, that needs to be transformed as well. And hopefully, if we try to use these methods along with various other methods, I'm pretty sure in the forthcoming lecture, Dr. Siddhartha is going to talk about, as he said, from the perspective of gender and Marxism as well, including those methods and various other methods. If we try to implement these methods at an individual level, at a collective level, I personally believe that it is gradually and slowly going to open up the Indian science fiction, not only the Indian science fiction paradigm, not only to various disciplinary spaces, but it is also going to have a very strong positive impact on the ways we usually interpret knowledges around us in our real life, in the fictional spaces, or in any other spaces that exist around us. Thank you so much, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Dr. Sayan. We have structured this session with a feedback form that we are going to share, where Dr. Sayan's talk, the questions will be related from Dr. Sayan's talk. I would like to invite the participants to put up their questions or doubts if they have any. In the meanwhile, I'm going to share the feedback form with all of you in this chat section, and my formal vote of thanks would be after the Q&A session. So if any one of you have any question to ask, you may. And please let me know the form that I have shared. Is it easily you are able to type it, or you have enough time? Please listen to this instruction very carefully. You have half an hour to fill this form. So please don't do it in any hush-hush manner. You are going to be evaluated and you are going to get certificate on the basis of this feedback form. So please take your time and fill it.
I think Umesh Kumar raised his hand. I don't know if it is for a question or something.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon to you. I'm Umesh, PhD Research Scholar at the Karnataka University, Dharwad. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful session, sir. I have a question for you. Initially, you mentioned that gender studies could be connected very well to the science fiction writing genre as far as Indian literature is concerned. Can you please throw some light on that? Because I'm not clear how gender studies could be connected to science fiction writing. So this is my question. Can you just give more clarity on this point?
Yes. So yeah, thank you so much, Umesh, for this question. So basically what I meant that when I say that gender studies could be connected to Indian science fiction writing. So it's about the question of interpretation, right? Like when we interpret a particular writing, in general, when we read any sort of fictional work, whether we are reading a novel or a short story, what happens, we encounter various characters. We encounter the experiences of various characters, and their experiences are positioned within certain diverse set of context. It could be a family context, a cultural context, an institutional context, work context, whatever. Now, my point of sharing that how we can connect gender studies with Indian science fiction is to bring in the various paradigms of gender studies in interpreting those experiences of characters, whether we are writing about those characters, we are reading those characters, trying to understand those characters within our wider socio-cultural space. Now, the way we are trying to understand those characters and read those characters in a wider socio-cultural space is actually how if there are certain gender experiences, there are certain sexual experiences of the characters, there could be certain queer experiences of the characters. So it is at that point of time where we bring in the various theoretical and the experiential aspects of gender studies, if it is associated with sexual studies, if it is associated with queer studies, into our methods of interpretation. That is basically what I meant, that how we can associate gender studies with Indian science fiction. I don't know, Umesh, if that answers your question.
Umesh, I think there is some network issue at his end.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. I'm convinced.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Umesh, for this question. Now, Dr. Sayan, Arundhati Nath has a question. Do you want to ask it yourself, Arundhati? Please go ahead. Her question is, sir, can you suggest some Indian fiction writers to read according to you?
Sir, you're not audible. Please unmute yourself.
Yes. Yeah, I was just saying that actually it's such a such a sort of, it's a very important question, but also it's such a diverse question. Like, now some of the authors, obviously, very recent authors, you have like Samit Basu, then Vandana Singh, Gautam Bhatia, they are writing. Then also it's Priya Chabria is also there. They're writing a lot on a lot of interesting aspects of Indian science fiction writing, where they address where they also bring, very interestingly, the caste and the gender issues very prominently in their writings actually. So these could be the four, like some of the names. Like there are so many names, and I'm pretty sure when Dr. Siddhartha will be presenting, he also is going to present quite a few writers and their works. But yes, these could be some of the ways, because I particularly named them because they kind of try to deviate from the usual genres of Indian fiction writing. Yes, what I will do is after my presentation, don't worry, I could see somebody has put up there that if I can repeat the names. So obviously it's difficult to follow when I speak. I will just put down the names, whatever I've shared in the chat box, so that you all can access. But I just want to briefly share that why I think these names are important for me, because they deviate from the usual mainstream Indian fiction writing and bring in a lot of those perspectives, cultural, social perspectives, which have not much been spoken about so far. So I named these 3-4 names. But as I said, I mean, this is just a speckle on this whole ocean. Like there is a lot of very interesting, very new sort of writings that are coming up from diverse perspectives. Dalit fictions, Dalit science fictions is also another very interesting area to look about. Queer Indian science fiction is another very interesting area to look about. These are very emerging, very new, and very interesting in nature. So I would also like to invite you to think around writers, to look around for writers who does in queer science, Indian science fiction, Dalit Indian science fiction, and other spaces. But yes, and I'll type the names, don't worry, after my space is over. Yes.
I think most of them are filling their feedback forms. I invite the participants to ask their questions or their observations about research perspectives in Indian science fiction.
Good morning, everyone. I have a question. for Dr. Sayan. So, like you mentioned, this whole thing of diversity while interpreting this science fiction novels in general. So, I have a question like, whenever we read science fiction novels by an international author, it's seen in a very global context. But when it comes to Indian science fiction novels or some other region from the third world countries, it's highly marginalized. Like the thing, like if an Indian writer writes it, they say that there will be some sort of Indianness, which is very much fine. But can we take it to a whole global level where we can say that the writer has written it in a global context as well? Because science fiction is something which we cannot say that belongs to a particular region, or it's only relatable with us who are Indians and not on a global context like other authors have written. Like for instance, if I take novels like Frankenstein, or for instance, if I take novels like Dune, we have readers from across the globe. But when it comes to our contribution to that, it is highly marginalized. So how can we counteract that?
Yeah, I think Ragini, this is a very important point that you raised, because it kind of invites me to this whole paradigm that what is global and what is local. That perspective has long been questioned, but to a vast extent it exists still, and there is a whole sort of politics of locally identifying something and globally identifying something. Now, the texts that you mentioned, they all emerge in a different local context. They all emerge in a specific local context, the specific political context, specific geographical context. But those texts at one point of time, after a certain period of time, they emerged globally relevant. While you shared that there are a lot of texts which are specifically contextualized in India, they often fail to attain that global stature. They often fail to attain that global identity, if I put it in that way. Now, that is where critical diversity literacy comes into the play, because is to dismantle this whole problematic idea of what is global and what is local, and failing to understand that a very local thing could be global, and a very global paradigm is also very much local as well. Because every idea, every thought emerges in very specific context, and then those ideas and thoughts then spreads out, and then it goes into a sort of global context by interweaving and interconnecting with various cultures, traditions, and context. So it is also important, and that is why again this whole sort of critical diversity literacy is important, because it invites us to think a particular idea, a particular text, in so many diverse contexts, that it will automatically open up so many spaces for global exchanges. And this is why this intersectionality, acknowledgement of positionality, critical diversity literacy is so very important for us. Because the moment we indulge these methods in our habitual interpretative processes, that is how we open up spaces across disciplines. That is how we invite people into our spaces. We get invited into other spaces, and that is how we generate this network, expand our network of interpretations, and that is how a local idea emerges to be global.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Sayan, Shubhadeep has a remark to make. Sir, I guess the recognition has a lot to do with translation, especially written in regional languages. If we consider Professor Shanku, it is originally written in Bengali, but now with translation, it is coming to forefront and starts claiming global recognition.
Absolutely, Shubhadeep. I mean, translation is one of those tools. Absolutely. I mean, no doubt about that. Translation is one of those tools, which actually puts a very local work into the global space, and we have seen that around. But also, as I believe that it is also important that in what ways we are translating, because the translation itself is so politically structured. Like it's not just about translating a set of words and phrases, but it is a translation of ideas, contexts, it's a translation of emotions, and so many aspects. So translation is one way of doing it, but if translation goes somewhere wrong, if it is a shoddy translation, then again it goes back to square one, that it will fail to generate a sort of global impact and remains locally restricted. But I completely agree with you that Shubhadeep, that translation is a very, very important tool.
So while the participants are filling their forms and preparing themselves for any doubt and questions to ask from you, Dr. Sayan, I take this opportunity to thank you for your erudite thoughts, your structured lecture, come interactive session that you managed to bring so much in just this 40 to 45 minute talk, plus answering all the questions in such a detailed manner. We at Literary Club, at IIHS, Kurukshetra University are immensely grateful to you for your efforts and time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jimmy, and thank you so much, all of you, for such reflections, questions, and for having me in this space. And I'm very much also excited and looking forward to the following reflections as well. True. And yes, I mean, while also you are filling up the forms, in case you have any query, any confusion, you can share that as well, because it's not an examination. So it's not that you can't ask questions. You are very, very warmly welcome to ask questions. If you want me to repeat a particular idea, if you want me to repeat any particular method, anything else like you want me to share, just feel free to unmute yourself or ask the question or put it in the chat box, whatever is comfortable for you.
Dr. Sayan, I want to share something related to the previous workshop that we organized. We at Literary Club, we tried to bring Dr. Shami for, Dr. Shami actually talked about the introduction to Indian science fiction, and he brought in detail about the history overview of Indian science fiction writers, the detailed structure of this genre and other important perspectives. So I asked my students at undergraduate level, BA English honors students, to prepare certain papers, research papers on science fiction based on the lecture that Dr. Sami gave. And then 4 to 5 students brought their research papers, and I was very happy and contented in the heart of my own heart, because it is very difficult when you see students from post-graduation and PhD level that they are trying to write, but then these students at such a young level, they are trying to write and find critical lenses and they are applying it. So I think this mission of educating people and newcomers to acquaint themselves with this new genre, I felt so contented as a mentor to them. So their work is commendable, and I feel as a teachers, we are motivated by our students a lot, many a time in our teaching career. So I take this opportunity also to thank my students for always being equally motivated and always receptive to all the ideas that I come up with and then I share with them.
No, absolutely. I think this is a very good exercise. I mean, that is what we all need to do to continue with this whole sort of discourse. I mean, it should not end with just one event and just one filling up the forms. But the most important part of these discourses, of these exchanges, are what I believe is that about the kind of continuity that we generate, the kind of transformation that we bring into our respective ways of interpretations when we carry forward these learnings. And absolutely, I think this is a great idea. And this process actually can be continued because in the process of making posters as well, as I said, that Indian science fiction also invites us to, think around, invites us to, engage with our interpretations, not only in the forms of essays and writings, but also in the form of poster presentations as well, where we can, where all the students can come together and generate one poster, or maybe it's the students are divided into groups of 4 to 5, and they generate a set of posters, out of what they have, drawn out of these conversations in terms of images, bullet points, ideas, connecting it with their readings, what they do as a part of their syllabus in the university. So I think it's a very important way that we keep on indulging and involving ourselves in these sort of discourses.
Yes, thanks for this advice. I'm going to apply this. Very true. In the previous workshop, we had the second session by Dr. Urvashi Kulhad from RLA College, Delhi University. She also brought a detailed discussion on the genre of Indian women science fiction writers. So she talked in detail about the main female writers who are writing in this genre. So I think these workshops actually gave us stimulating ideas to the researchers as well.
I see there is somebody with the name of Gulshan Kumar who has raised the hand. I don't know if it is for a question or something else.
Gulshan, go ahead if you have a question to ask.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. And thank you, sir, for a wonderful lecture. Sir, I am more interested in how science fiction affects us. In an era of climate change, technological advancement, AI advancements, do you think science fiction, and especially Indian science fiction, has any power to change our minds? Or can it even make us aware of the future that awaits us?
Yes, thank you so much, Gulshan, for putting up this question, because during the lecture, I thought of touching on this point and somewhere it just went off my head. So I think, yes, Indian science fiction narratives, especially in the fields that you mentioned, Anthropocene, climate change, environmental collapses, etc., to generate awareness against these sort of problems. I think Indian science fiction does play a very important role there, because what we see as fictional narratives is often a proposition of generating a parallel space, a possible parallel space, where we can all coexist with each other in a very respectful and caring and sharing manner. A lot of these science fiction works invite us to think. Obviously, they are fictionally constructed, they are imaginative in nature, but there is also often a source of possibility to look into how we can apply those fictional space into the realistic space. And that is how I believe that many of the Indian science fiction works are also generated. Is not just about for entertainment. It is not just about some sort of lame imagination and then leaving it out there, but it is also a sort of invitation to think of alternate spaces of existence. It is also a sort of invitation to think of diverse forms of existence, which we may have thought impossible so far, but that could be made possible in various ways. So based on that, I very much think that Indian science fiction also plays a very important role of creating awarenesses about our environment, about the various sort of challenges that we are encountering on a habitual basis. I don't know, Gulshan, if that answers your question.
Sure, sir.
Yes, Shruti, well, Dalit Indian science fiction is again, I think it's a lot of connected to what Gulshan actually raised, that it is a sort of space that is being generated to create awareness. Usually it's not so far, it's an upcoming space, and hopefully in the coming days it's going to diversify with a lot of works. But now, because it's upcoming, it mostly existing in the point of comic strips, comic presentations, and a lot of works are expected to come up in the form of full-fledged fictional works. But again, Dalit science fiction is again a way of generating awareness about the Dalit cultures, about the Dalit traditions, about the lifestyle, to interrogate and dismantle the whole sort of, historically, the whole sort of caste and cultural hierarchies, which is, again, Dalit is not just a question of caste, it is also a question of race as well. And it is also an invitation to think around how the caste and race intersects with each other, and what sort of awareness needs to be generated about the whole racial question in India as well, apart from the caste question.
Gulshan, you have again raised your hand. If you want to ask, you can go ahead.
Sir, you have listed a term, science and fiction studies, in one of your slides. And sir, can you please elaborate about that? I'm more interested in that.
Wait, let me just open up my slide first. Can you just please repeat your question once?
Sir, you have listed a term, science and technological studies, I think.
Oh, yes. In my presentation, I was talking about science and technological studies. Yes. So see, science and technology studies is a very interesting paradigm, where to kind of say in a very simple terms, it is how science, the paradigms of science and technology interacts with the paradigms of humanities and social sciences and cultural studies. Usually, and why this space have been curated, it emerges from a very, usually for a long period of time, it was a very Eurocentric disciplinary space, which emerged in a very white, heteronormative kind of space. And it was problematic in various ways, but now, and there has been a lot of calls about decolonizing the science and technology study space. But it is kind of spreading across the global south. It is a way of inviting that science and technology, if you usually see the attitude of these whole discipline has been so far that they are at some sort of on a very different level. And they think that they are the most superior sort of discipline, and they don't need to interact and learn about the various functionalities of the other disciplinary spaces. But if you look in real life, what happens, science and technology is a very part of our cultures, about our traditions, about our lifestyles, about our daily ways of existence. So it is very difficult to distinguish and segregate the space of science and technology from our respective cultural experiences, social experiences, religious experiences, especially in our practical life, when we see that our accessibility to science and technology are so much motivated by so many different social, cultural, and various other financial and so many other factors as well. So science and technology studies is an invitation to kind of bring in this paradigm of science and technology from that whole, romanticized superior space, and bring it down to our respective, practical space of our existence, and to see how science and technology gets influenced by our habitual cultural experiences, social experiences, and various other forms of daily life experiences. So that is the basic of science and tech studies. But obviously, I mean, it's emerging in a lot of, I know in a lot of IITs, they are introducing science in STS, which is in acronym known as STS, as a sort of discipline for PhD research and other sort of research projects. Hopefully, in the coming days, it would spread across the country. I am also sharing a few links out there in the chat box. You may think of accessing them because that will give you some more idea about science fiction, Dalit studies. I see there is another hand. It's by, I don't know, it's Aina Singh.
Yes, sir. So in terms of navigating through the secondary material that's available, I have this question because especially right now, it's a space in which not a lot of work has come out. So is there a tendency for there to be a sort of monopoly, or at least for publication, politics, and connections between different people in academia, for there to be a sort of monopoly because of that? And as I'm noticing, certain texts are being suggested over and over again, and those texts have become the sort of authoritative voices in this emerging area. So how does one navigate through that as an emerging research scholar? How does one be more mindful of the text that we are spending time engaging with?
Well, through navigating, to navigate and counter this hierarchy, one of the best ways of doing is to write more and more about these spaces. To engage, the more and more scholars need to come forward to engage and write about these spaces and to break away from this monopoly. I mean, that's the only way. We need to generate more scholarships, we need to generate more literatures, and that is how we counter. Often we have a tendency of sitting and criticizing that, this is the only work that exists, this is the only these 2, 3 or set of works that exist. But that is not, I mean, instead of criticizing, they exist because we have allowed them to exist in that monopoly space. If we keep inviting ourselves, writing ourselves, think from different corner points, and that is what actually connects to the methods that I shared. That is bringing our respective context, bringing our respective interpretations, bringing our respective thoughts, our ideas about our perspectives, our ways of thinking onto the plate, which may not be acceptable to all of us, but it should exist right there to establish a literature. And to establish a whole sort of literature around us is to think and write more and more. So I think this could be one of the possible ways of countering that monopoly.
Thank you.
there is a comment by Dr. Darshan Lal who says that Dalit fiction can't be science fiction, it's a literature of protest. Well, I mean, so far I haven't said that Dalit fiction is science fiction for a single time. I was specifically talking about Dalit science fiction, and which is very different from Dalit fiction. So probably my presentation or my reflection kind of created a confusion. But yes, just to clarify that Dalit fiction and science fiction are very different, obviously, and I'm specifically talking about Dalit science fiction, number one, and number two, science. I really don't understand why science fiction can't be a literature of protest. If science fiction can be a literature of awareness, science fiction can be a very strongly a literature of protest as well. And I think, again, it connects to Gulshan's reflection of the question